A single trigger pull turns a quiet afternoon into a crime scene, and the city's heartbeat into a siren that never stops. Samantha's blood is still warm on the concrete when the story fractures, love splinters into rage, and grief sharpens into a blade with Martin's name carved into the hilt. The killer is not a stranger from the shadows but Nathan, the man whose secrets fattened in the dark until they demanded a sacrifice. What follows is not a chase but a moral free fall, a lover remade into a hunter, a sinner cornered by his own fear, a system tempted to fail exactly when it is needed most. This is a chronicle of motives dressed as mercy, of debts paid in veins rather than currency, of justice that risks becoming a mirror of the crime it condemns. Read on, if you are willing to watch a good man decide how much of his soul he can afford to burn. When Nathan pulled the trigger in a moment that should have been inviolable on a windless afternoon, time shattered into painful grains that rattled down inside Martin's chest. Samantha lay there, her gaze not yet fully dimmed like a question abandoned halfway, and each drop of blood seeping into the ground became scarlet letters writing the sentence that fate pressed onto the rest of the lives still breathing. Rage did not arrive like a sudden blaze, it smoldered and writhed, draining the warmth from his bones and casting a cold metal core in Martin's mind. From that core, thoughts sprouted like steel thorns, each barb aimed at a single point: Nathan must pay. But fury never travels alone, it drags conflict behind it, because somewhere deep inside Martin a small part still stirred, knowing revenge would not bring back memories, would not exchange for all the time Samantha tilted her head onto his shoulder after work, would not scour away the guilt over the days he chased his own ambitions and left her to face the undertow alone. Elsewhere, Nathan sat in a low-ceilinged attic where damp crept into his clothes and fear crawled up his nape like a living thing, but heavier than fear lay a layer of ash over his reasons. He knew his finger had erased any chance of redemption, only that hours earlier the pieces had spun too fast, a threatening call from the abyss that owned his debts, a photo of Samantha with a confidential file she had held for a colleague, a faint date in the corner tied to the fiasco that had slid his life into shadow. He believed she would expose the chain of his mistakes, he feared the moment of being unmasked more than any cell, and in him, fear took the shape of the worst decision. Once done, only habit remained, the habit of those who live by instinct, run, erase traces, self-justify with patchwork arguments that it was an accident, that he never meant it. But facts are cold, and a crime scene does not lie. It tells the whole story through the position of a spent casing, the angle of a falling body, the print of a shoe across a shallow puddle, even the ragged rhythm of breath from someone who has just killed. Martin followed those facts the way a believer clings to the last remaining commandment. He returned to Samantha's office, saw the notes not yet stacked into a neat file and remembered her saying this work could touch what no one wanted to touch, remembered dinners cut short by urgent calls, remembered her hands swollen from typing because she was laying a road to a less shadowed future for the nameless. From that memory, he tied a thread of reason around his wrist as a fragile reminder: proceed with evidence, deliver Nathan to the light of the law. That resolve was ground to grit whenever he closed his eyes and saw Samantha's last bead of blood darkening a strand of hair on her brow. When pain reaches a certain pitch, people start calling revenge justice because legal justice is too slow, too cold, too far from the place where their hearts are torn. Martin entered days long as tunnels, where breath was measured by how many pens he snapped in two, sleep by how many alarms he did not silence, hope by how many traces of Nathan still clung to corners he had passed. He gathered Nathan's morning habit of coffee too sweet, gathered the skittish glance whenever he crossed a street under a camera, gathered a lighter engraved with old initials that only someone close would give. Each piece adhered with the glue called obsession, and obsession shoved a man to that brink where old principles fell like dry leaves. As Martin hunted, those around him were dragged into the storm's orbit. Samantha's colleagues swallowed grief to finish reports, her mother sat motionless by the window each evening as if waiting for a bird that would never return, and the old friend who had been her bridge to the confidential file lived in fear, knowing someone was digging through the past with an iron shovel rather than bare hands. Layers of motive surfaced like sinews. Nathan's creditor wanted to seal the mouths of any evidence that led back to him, a petty official needed to shift responsibility to keep his chair, and a fringe cluster sought to turn Samantha's death into a bargaining chip in backroom trades. Martin saw the lattice crisscross under his feet but had no goodwill left to untie it by talks or deals. He wanted to sever it with one cut, and in his imagination Nathan became the keystone rope. Pull that rope and the whole web would fall. That imagining was dangerous because it simplified a world born complicated, but a person on fire gropes for the easy like a reflex gropes for water. He traced the path to the shabby attic, saw Nathan's damp coat hanging by the window, saw a half-kept journal with the handwriting of a man wrestling between flight and confession. In a corner lay an old photograph of Nathan with his late father, revealing he had once been another version of himself, gentle eyes and a hand clutching a schoolboy's running trophy. It strangled Martin in a strange way because it told him no one is born a killer, but a string of wrong choices and one shove from fate can turn a straight line into a dashed one. Instead of softening, that recognition made his anger evolve into something new, thornier and more violent, because he feared he was beginning to understand the enemy. To understand is to soften, and to soften is to betray Samantha. In those nights Nathan glimpsed Martin's silhouette in shop windows. Being hunted numbed his fingertips, yet what pushed him nearer the edge was his memory of Samantha, not as a victim but as someone who spoke of courage the way others speak of a daily habit. That memory tied him to the question of whether it was time to stop running, whether he could put himself on the scales of justice before another barrel put him there. Behind him loomed the creditor, a faceless shape arriving only through curt messages that demanded Nathan stay silent or disappear forever. Ahead of him stood Martin, whose steps had shed their last light. Two doors opened into night. Nathan chose the one that seemed less filthy in his warped imagining, lure Martin into a trap, stage another accident, knot every shred of proof into a cul-de-sac, then vanish into another city with another name. He thought the plan clever, but the smell of gunpowder never lies. It clings to a hem like guilt to memory, and Martin only had to breathe to know he was close. That rainy night, lightning split the sky like surgical blades, and the black handfuls of rain covered old tin roofs while Martin leaned against a wall, fingers locked around something cold as a brief manifesto of the cruelty he was about to impose on another life. His inner conflict screamed, one side craving the hush of a debt repaid, the other insisting he hand the man to the court to avoid becoming a more ghastly version of his enemy. Memory surged in like tide, not of Samantha's death, but of her steel against soft pressure, how she would lay each piece of proof on the table like setting foundation stones, how she always believed there was a lawful path even if it was slow and rutted. That memory hammered in time with his heart, slicking his palms with sweat and setting his nails biting into skin. At the alley's far end, Nathan emerged bloodless as a shade, his eyes the color of sleepless nights, his faltering steps reflecting the descent of a man. Two currents of fury, two kinds of fear, two bundles of memory, two theories of justice stood just yards apart, both knowing any decision in this second would finish one life, or two. The tension stretched so tight that even the rain changed tempo, but no words cut the air. Only breathing, the slap of water on tin, and the metallic rasp of choices grinding against each other. Martin thought of Samantha's mother, the old friend trembling over the file that could expose debts and names, the children playing outside the corner shop who would one day learn from this story that the only way to set wrongs right is to do right, not to do wrong differently. He knew if he pushed Nathan face first into the mud, he would spin the wheel of hatred one more turn, and he would become proof that pain makes people choose shortcuts. He also knew if he stepped back, tomorrow or next month the same darkness that had driven Nathan to pull a trigger would shove someone else. Between those two knowings, he chose the harder one, refuse himself the privilege of playing judge, refuse his rage the power to decide. He shook so hard with anger that even streetlights turned into knife slashes, yet he hoisted a dry procedure in his mind: maintain distance, neutralize risk, call the responsible authorities to collect the scene, lock each link according to law. That wasn't forgiveness, it was the only way to keep the human part of him from being scorched. But life rarely allows people to finish their intentions in order. From the alley's end came a third set of footsteps, quick, urgent, the cheap reek of perfume tangled with smoke, and the creditor's shape surfaced like a fever. Everything unfolded in disjointed frames. A flash from the object in his hand, Nathan's silhouette pitching, Martin pivoting by the instinct of someone who has lived too long beside alarms, and the wind whiplashing rain into his eyes. In that instant reason and rage struck with a dry crack, and reality added a new variable to a formula already overburdened. The creditor had no use for justice, he wanted permanent silence, and to get it he needed to erase both debtor and hunter. Martin understood then that private revenge was only a branch on the black tree called violence. Cut the branch and, if the root remained, it would sprout again. That realization shoved him back toward the original choice even faster, because now he wasn't facing a single person but a filthy mechanism powered by fear. He compressed every tremor into a single break line, forbidding his hands to shake, forbidding his eyes to blur, forcing his heartbeat to match the steps required, force the enemy to show himself, record the details, preserve his own life and, though his fury howled, preserve Nathan's life as a living link down into the mire's depth. The rain washed old mottled blood away, leaving the concrete like a cracked mirror reflecting faces that did not want to look. After the chaos, the city resumed its rhythm, and Martin stepped out of the alley with eyes no longer naive even though he had not lifted the thing he had intended to use to end it all. The anger remained, a smoldering streak along his ribs. The inner conflict remained, a needle that sometimes bored into his palm, but he understood that keeping both alive within limits was the final way not to betray Samantha's legacy. Nathan, trapped between an instinct to self-destruct and the last cry of what little human in him still survived, became witness to the irreversible consequences of a single decision. He learned that some barrels do not aim at the heart but at a person's ability to trust himself, and once they fire, the rest of life becomes a daily labor of gathering those fragments of trust. The others, the mother curled by the window, the friend clutching the file, the colleagues piecing shattered accounts, the children at the corner, were all pulled into an invisible mesh where every small choice carried aftershocks. When night closed with a thin film of mist across the glass, Martin stood alone in the room where Samantha's shadow had once spilled each evening, his hand on the drawer where she had kept photographs proving her belief that every truth deserves to be named by the voice of the law. He swore nothing, set no grand aim, he only knew tomorrow would hurt. But inside that hurt he would walk, step by dry step the way she had believed, gathering evidence, dragging the chain out, hauling the creditor into light, and then placing Nathan, the man who had taken the woman he loved, before a sentence not decided by a barrel. He knew the road would press him to the brink, push his anger to its limit, make the conflict in him screech like bent metal, but he also knew only thus would Samantha's death not be fed into the next cycle of violence. Somewhere outside, a garbage truck clattered by with the ordinary clamor of a city continuing despite the lives just fallen from its flow. Within that sound, Martin recognized a bitter, necessary truth: betrayal, selfish motive, impulsive choice, all can break a person. But if just one person will stand at the lip of the pit and refuse to fling more mud into another's face, the spiral slows, if only a little. A little is enough for a gentle memory to find purchase, for a nearly extinguished faith to breathe, and for a roaring anger, still smoldering, to learn to lie still beneath the skin of a human being.